Welcome from the University of St Andrews to our graduates, colleagues and friends watching from across the globe. I'm Catherine Dunford and I work in development as the Alumni Relations Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic Engagement Coordinator. Saints Talks are short presentations by leading members of our academic community on subjects we hope are of general interest. As you know, our Saints Talk today will be given by Professor Graham Turnbull, and it's titled Future Smart Lighting Beyond Setting the Mood. The talk will last for around 30 minutes, and then Professor Turnbull will take questions. If you would like to ask a question, they can be added to the team's Q&A. Please don't put your full name down for data protection reasons. Graham Turnbull is a professor of physics in the School of Physics and Astronomy. He's the former head of school and conducts his research in the Organic Semiconductor Centre. He became faculty at the University of St Andrews in 2003 and received his chair in 2015. He is also an alumnus. In his research in the Organic Semiconductor Centre, Professor Turnbull is making new types of lighting that can communicate while they illuminate. He also studies materials that can sense their environment through changes in the light they emit. His research aims to develop new technologies for fast mobile communications using visible light and to detect traces of chemicals such as explosives and pollutants in the environment. In this Saints Talk, Professor Turnbull will discuss how the bulb and the materials from which it is made can be smart in themselves. We are now surrounded by smart devices, and it seems that they are only going to get smarter, one component at a time. So this is a very important subject. Welcome, Professor. We're very much looking forward to hearing your Saints Talk.
Great, thank you very much. Good. So in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a remarkable change in how we light our homes, how we light our streets, how we receive light from television screens and mobile phone displays. And underpinning all of these big changes are a number of innovations in materials that emit light. Firstly, the invention of the blue gallium nitride LED, which has underpinned an incredible change in home lighting, and we no longer use Thomas Edison's incandescent lamp anywhere. And secondly, also, it's enabled things like having a television screen inside your pocket is something that's just unimaginable without solid state lighting. The second major innovation has been in the field of organic light emitting diodes, or OLEDs, which are very rapidly becoming the principal way of making television screens and screens in your phone. So what I'm going to do in this talk is tell you about some of the future innovations that some of these sorts of technologies hopefully will unlock. So on top of being incredibly power efficient, and that's one of the driving forces for solid state lighting, they also open up opportunities for what's called smart lighting. So on the image on the screen shows a picture of smart lighting in the home from Philips, where you can control the mood of your room by a voice command or tapping a button on your phone. But actually, there are opportunities to have much smarter lighting in the future, and I'm going to try to sell this idea to you through a couple of examples that relate to the research we're doing in St Andrews. First of all, I'm going to talk about lighting that can communicate data while it illuminates through the region that it illuminates. And that's the idea of LiFi. And secondly, I'm going to talk about lighting materials that we study that can sense and interact with their environment and can be used for chemical sensing. Both of these areas of research are based on a common set of materials called organic semiconductors. Organic semiconductors are a remarkable class of plastics and thin films of molecules that have some quite unusual properties. Unlike most plastics, these materials are electrically conducting. In fact, they're electrical semiconductors. And secondly, they can be stimulated either optically or electrically to emit visible light. Because they're plastics, we can tune their properties easily. And because they can be processed from solution, it opens up the possibility of a new field of printed electronic devices. Within St Andrews, in the Organic Semiconductor Centre, we have a group of chemists and physicists working together to develop new materials, understand how the materials interact with light, and to develop these into devices and applications. The sorts of things that we're interested in are in making organic LEDs or OLEDs, making lasers and solar cells, and understanding how to optimize and improve these devices by studying the physics of their light emission. The ultimate aim of our research is to make devices that are useful for applications, and the application areas that we collectively are interested in the Organic Semiconductor Centre are displays and lighting, in energy harvesting, for developing chemical sensors, and for applications in medicine and biology. So in order to attack this sort of very wide range of problems needs a large number of people with a wide range of skills. And so before I go any further, I'm going to put my hand up and say, this is not all my work, it's the work of a large number of researchers that have been working with myself and principally with Ivor Samuel over the last decade or so. And in particular, I'd like to highlight a few of these researchers. Let's see if we can pointer. With contributions that I'll talk about today from Pavlos Manisiadis and Ko Yoshida in the data communication side, and Roscoe Landers, Edward Ogogu, Ian Campbell and James Glacken on the sensing side. As well as the team in St Andrews, we also have a wide range of collaborators who bring in other expertise in data communication science, in chemistry for developing new materials, and biology, and in other applications areas that we're interested in developing. So it's a big team effort to do the sorts of things I'm going to explain. But to start off with, I want to talk about communications, wireless communications using light. So most of our wireless communications use microwave transmitters, like a Wi-Fi data access point, which has certain limitations. If you are in a densely populated room, then you're aware that the data that's being fed out by the Wi-Fi access point is shared out between all the users, and the speed of everybody's data transmission goes down. One way that you might address this issue is to, instead or in addition to the Wi-Fi access point, to have a series of data transmitters coming from the light bulbs in your room. In that situation, the light can, as well as illuminating a region of the room, can also send data to that specific part of the room, while a separate lighting unit might give an independent data stream to a different part of the room. And then you have multiple transmitters that are sending individual or independent data streams to many people. The idea of using light to transmit data has another advantage in that it is intrinsically more secure than microwaves. With a microwave access point, you can still, out in the garden or on the street, you can still get data from your Wi-Fi. With lighting, if you close the curtains, then the data is secure in the room that you're transmitting it. This gentleman at the top of my screen is Professor Harold Haas, who's one of our close collaborators, and Harold is one of the pioneers of the idea of LiFi and set up the Scottish company Pure LiFi to develop some of these ideas. How do we send information using light? So this is an example of a wireless optical data link. We have a transmitting light bulb at one end of the room, and we have a photodetector at the other end of the room, and which acts as the receiver of the information. And in the simplest configuration, what we do is we simply switch the light on and off. This is called on-off keying, and essentially what happens is if there's light on, then we're sending a binary digit of 1. If the light is off, we send a binary digit of 0, and so we can send a stream of 1s and 0s to transmit the data. That all sounds easy, but there are some challenges, and challenges that the materials can have a chance to solve. The first of these challenges that I want to present to you is one where the white LEDs are just not fast enough. In order to explain that, what I need to do is to describe how you make a white LED. So the white LEDs in your lighting units at home are almost certainly, most of them are actually blue light emitting diodes with a yellow color converting phosphor deposited on the top of it. So the blue LEDs emit the blue light, the yellow phosphor absorbs some of that blue light and then transmits that light. It absorbs from the blue light and then re-emits it as green, yellow and red light to fill in the rest of the white light spectrum. And one of the problems is that the light emission from the phosphor does not change quickly enough. So whenever you make a material emit light by feeding in energy, and that could be by shining in ultraviolet light, or it could be sending an electrical current, then the light emission will continue to emit. There's some sort of afterglow from the emitter for a short time after you switch off the electricity or the UV stimulation. In some materials, that afterglow can last all night, like on the display on your alarm clock, and it continues to glow for many hours. In other materials, that afterglow may be a millisecond or a microsecond or a nanosecond, so it can be very, very short. But there's always this slow release of the light. So how does that impact our data communications? So here's an example where we send data through out from our light bulb, and if we input a set of data that, I'm just going to change my pointer because it's going terribly slow. Okay, so if we send in a stream of 1s and 0s, so we send in some high voltages and some low voltages into the light bulb, then what comes out is something that looks like this. If we try to modulate the light bulb on and off too quickly, we can turn the light on very quickly because the light will switch on as soon as we start feeding a current through it. But when we switch the current off and hope that the information is going to a dark phase, what happens is that phosphor continues just to decay away its light emission gradually. And that's a problem, because if we want to look to see if we have received at our red end a 1 or a 0 in information, then we happily receive the 1. However, if we try to look at the data too soon after we switch the light off, then what we can find is there's still some residual emission. And so some of the 0s that we're trying to transmit might actually come out above our decision threshold, and we might receive them as a bit of 1. And so we start to feed in errors into the data stream if we try to modulate faster than the light emission can turn off. So what do we do? So what we want to do is to look for other materials that might allow us to modulate the light emission faster than the phosphors. So this graph here is showing the amount of fluorescence that remains being emitted from the material after we stop stimulating it to emit. And if you note, the timescale here is only 50 nanoseconds, 50 billionths of a second, but that becomes significant for the sort of experiment we're trying to do. So this shows the gradual fall away of the light emission from our conventional lighting phosphor. If we look at a more modern phosphor, like a quantum dot nanoparticle, that gives up its energy a little bit quicker. If we look at organic semiconductors, we can empty out the energy from the light emitting material much faster and switch off the light much more quickly. In particular, if we look at semiconducting polymers, that light emission can be emitted extremely fast after you switch off the signal. And so that gives us a tremendous opportunity to send very, very fast data streams. So here's an example of doing that. Here's an organic semiconductor color converter made from a polymer called super yellow, which we are illuminating with the blue light from an LED. We send that combined white light over a 2-meter link to a detector and modulate that data. So one of the things that we need to do is, in order to have a lighting unit, is to have a good quality spectrum that will give you a nice natural lighting of the room that you're trying to light. And we achieve this by changing the properties or changing the amount of the polymer or blending together different light emitting materials in order to tune the color that's emitted. And then when we send in a stream of data into the LED, that modulates the light emission from the phosphor. And what we find is that we can achieve data transmission rates beyond 1,000 megabits per second. So with a single LED. So for just to benchmark that, so my home Wi-Fi on a good day might do 5 or 10 megabits per second in its data transmission, and we're able to transmit perhaps 100 times that with this sort of technology. Now you'll note also that the author list on this paper when we demonstrated this result is quite long, and that's because there's a large number of people feeding in their expertise into the materials, into the development of the LEDs, into the way that you encode the data, and the hardware for the transmission, the data link transmission. So the materials, the organic semiconductor materials, can act as very fast color converters for the light emission. But could we just directly drive them themselves with an electrical signal and achieve similar gigabit per second data rates? So OLEDs are very widely used for displays and increasingly also in some architectural lighting applications. But organic semiconductors are not known to be very fast electronic materials like silicon. And that's essentially because the electrons, when they travel through the material, travel with some difficulty from molecule to molecule, and so they travel perhaps 1,000,000 times slower than the current flows through a silicon chip. So if we want to try to make an OLED transmit data at very high rates, then we have to think carefully about how you design the electronic properties of that OLED. So what is an organic LED? Essentially, it's a sandwich of an organic semiconductor material or materials between two electrical contacts. You apply a voltage across this sandwich, send current into through the contacts, and this generates light emission within the organic semiconductor. If you make one of the contacts partly transmitting, you can get the light to be emitted out. In practice, to do this well and to make a very efficient LED, you need a more complicated stack of different materials, and there's quite a lot of materials design and also device engineering goes in to control how the charges move in from each side and recombine and getting the light out. So here's an example of an OLED being tested for data communications. This is a small blue OLED. It's about 5 millimeters by 5 millimeters square. And what we're doing is just ramping up the modulation frequency. So we're turning the light on and off. And so this is all fine at the moment. We're just modulating at 30 hertz. And you can already see that at 30 hertz, you no longer see a significant flicker of the light. And so when we go up to 300 megahertz, then you're going to see, there's no chance you're going to see a flickering from the data transmission. so you can get illumination while sending essentially invisible data to the receiver. So in order to do this, to speed up from a few tens of hertz up to gigabits per second, you need to design the electrical structure very carefully. And this is a long piece of work by Dr. Koyoshida, who developed and optimized the OLEDs for this application to make them bright and to make them capable of being modulated on and off quickly. So this involved redesigning the structures so that we have different electrical contacts. The only way we could get the electricity in was to make the contacts both metal, which means you then have to carefully design a partially transmitting metal contact. And then you also have to worry about how you manage the heat from the structure and other engineering ideas in order to be able to get the electrical properties to match the very fast light emission properties. And so this was the end result, that with some very careful device design, you can get to a stage where you can modulate your LED and encode data so you can transmit more than a gigabit per second from a single organic LED. This is something like 30 times faster than anybody else had demonstrated in the past, about 100 times faster than the Wi-Fi at my home, and also we managed to demonstrate this for the first time over a practical 2-meter long data link, sort of ceiling to desk height data link. So what this result means, though, is that you can essentially from a single pixel in your OLED display, you could potentially transmit the maximum possible data rate that your mobile phone is able to handle. And so that's the sort of thing that could be useful in the future. Now, the optical data link has two ends. We have the transmitter at one end and we have a receiver at the other end. And there's a second major challenge when you look at trying to detect light, and that is that fast detectors are not very sensitive. The reason for this is that to make a fast detector, you normally need to have one that has very small area. And a small area detector does not pick up a large amount of the photons that are being sent from the transmitter. You can increase the amount of light that you receive by having a larger pixel area, but that then becomes more sensitive, but not as fast. So one solution to this, the obvious optical solution, is that you put a lens in the link between the transmitter and the detector. The lens collects a reasonable area of the light that's coming in and focuses that down onto your small fast photodiode. However, that comes at the cost of a problem, and that problem is that should I move my light to a different angle, then what I find is that the light now still gets focused through the lens, but gets focused to a point that doesn't hit the detector. And so by bringing in a lens into the data link, what you achieve is you can get more light and therefore higher data rates through your link, but it comes at the expense that it works well if the light is coming straight forwards, but if the light is coming from a different direction, it doesn't work at all. And what you have to do, the consequence is that you have to carefully align your receiver, your detector to the light source, and that becomes rather cumbersome. It turns out that there's a smart lighting solution at the detector end that can help you with this. And that is to use a thing called a fluorescent antenna. And this is work that we undertook together with Dominic O'Brien and Steve Collins at the University of Oxford. The idea is that if we have a thin film of our light emitting material, we can absorb light across the top surface of this film, and some of that light emission that's re-emitted gets trapped in the film and gets wave guided by being reflected towards an end. And we can end up with a rather more intense emission of light at the edge than the brightness that is hitting the top surface. So we can concentrate the light like the lens, but this doesn't have any alignment requirements. And so in our fluorescent antenna, the scheme is that you have this waveguide slab with the fluorescent material in it that needs to again be very fast in its response to the incoming data in the optical signal. The data comes in, gets absorbed in this material, and then gets refluoresced in a new direction towards a fast small photodetector at the edge of the film. So here's an example of one of these devices. This is in a data link that we developed as part of the UPVLC, Ultra Parallel Visible Light Communications project. And so what we have is we have a high definition TV data stream that is being fed through a light emitting diode in this lighting unit. And we are receiving that information onto this fluorescing film. The light is absorbed in the film, re-emitted, and comes to a fast photodetector on this side. And then we electrically decode that signal and to display the same HD TV signal on a second monitor. So this sort of idea is the way that we could envisage that these LiFi systems might be configured in the future. The other thing that I want to talk about in my presentation today is about how we can use these same materials in order to detect our surroundings. The idea here is we're going to look at chemical sensing. So essentially a technological replacement for the sniffer dog's nose. It turns out that our fluorescent materials, if a TNT molecule or similar comes into contact with the fluorescent molecule, it can act to turn off or modify the fluorescence. And so our electronic sniffer dog's nose is configured as I show here, that we have our thin film organic semiconductor, we illuminate it with light to make it fluoresce. And if a TNT molecule or other explosive molecule comes into contact with this film, then it will act to dim the lights. And if the lights are dimmed, then there's a signal that there's a dangerous vapor in the location of the sensor. How does this work? What we have is we have our thin film, and we expose this thin film to the atmosphere, which may have some TNT molecules shown as these blue triangles. These TNT molecules can absorb onto the surface of the thin film, and they interact with the polymer and stay there for a while and start to accumulate, and also start to diffuse down into through the bulk of the film. We then switch on a light, and when we switch on a light, we absorb a photon and create a thing called an exciton, which is the excited state that re-emits the light in the organic semiconductor. This exciton, before it emits the light in the time it takes for its afterglow, its short afterglow, it can diffuse, it can hop from molecule to molecule, and essentially can go searching for TNT molecules embedded in the film. If it does not find a TNT molecule in its lifetime of its afterglow, it will then just re-emit the light. If it comes into contact with the TNT molecule, it gives its energy to the TNT molecule, which does not emit, and then we get a dimming of the overall light emission. This first process is relatively slow. It takes seconds for the vapor to come into the film. The light emitting detection process all happens within a billionth of a second. So this is what you see. Over time, when we expose to the explosives, the trace concentration of explosives, we see the fluorescence from the film starts to drop away. If we then remove the source of the explosives and put the sensor in a clean environment with some materials, that fluorescence can recover back to where you started from, and so you can reset your sensor and detect again. These sensors are very good at detecting minute amounts of particular chemicals. So for TNT, for example, we can smell the smell from a tiny particle of TNT that is less than a microgram in mass. What they're not very good at, however, is they're not very good at discriminating between different molecules. So these fluorescent sensors are not very selective between what the materials are that they are detecting. And so multiple chemical vapors can potentially turn that light emission off. And so what you need are ways to distinguish between and identify the particular chemical that you're looking for. And the way that we are approaching this is looking at how the analyte molecules, the molecules we're trying to detect, diffuse into the film. And by differences in the molecular interactions, there's potential to get different signatures of different explosives, or to tell the difference between an explosive and some distractant vapor. And so what we do is we've studied how these molecules can diffuse into the film, and then when we remove the source of explosives, how they then diffuse after exposure. And from that, we can see a significant difference when we change the materials on the recovery of the light emission. Than that's a bigger difference than when we expose. So we can use a strategy of detecting a presence of an explosive when we expose to the explosive, and then we try and reset our sensor and we look at what happens, and that allows us to try to identify. We can manipulate this by thermally cycling the film, and we find that at particular temperatures, different explosive molecules are released. And so through the temperature of release, you may be, and the switch on again of the light emission, you can potentially work out what molecule you've got. We can also try to control the interactions using a strategy called molecular shape imprinting, where you actually form your films with the thing you try to detect embedded in the film. You wash those molecules out, but the film can be made to retain the shape of these analyte molecules, which can give us sort of detection centers to help make the system more selective. And then by using an array of different sensing materials, you can then start to try to fingerprint the molecules. Most of the motivation for this part of our research has been in detecting explosives, and we've had some initial attempts at trying to apply these in the outside world, including looking at IED materials and devices in collaboration with the Swedish Explosives Ordnance and Demining Centre, SWEDEC, in Ekio in Sweden. And we find that the fluorescence detection is rather better than their standard colorimetric tests that they use. We've also been looking at whether we can detect buried explosives, looking at landmines, or even just detecting minefields in collaboration with a number of Croatian partners, including the Croatian Mine Action Centre. And one aspect, a major aspect of this, is using colonies of honeybees that go and forage around and gather and bring material back from across an area to the beehive, and then we try to interrogate what material they have brought back to see if there are traces of explosives, to see if a field that they're foraging over might be a minefield. The area that we're really excited to drive forwards in this is something slightly different as well, though, and that's looking at water quality monitoring. And what we are doing is we're adapting the sensing techniques that we've used for detecting explosives to detecting pesticides and pharmaceuticals in water. And Ross Galander's pictured here is driving this forwards with a spin-out company called Lightwater Sensors that aims to develop a first option, essentially, for in situ monitoring of water bodies for a rapid detection of release of pollutants into reservoirs or water courses. So just to make a few final remarks, what I hope I've conveyed to you during the course of the last half hour is that solid state lighting technologies really have dramatically changed how we light our world and display information, and the underpinning material science that's enabled these technological developments are going to continue to drive forward some new technologies, which I think will have a big impact on our lives, though it could be that you are quite unaware that they are happening in the background, enabling data communications or making the environment safer. There's no doubt in my mind, however, that future lighting technologies are really going to become smart. We're going to be able to communicate information. We're going to be able to sense around our environment, and we're even going to be able to grow new crops or synthesize new materials through biological processes. And that's another new area that we're working on in smart lighting that I've just not had time to talk about. So anyway, so thank you very much for your information, for your attention, and I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Professor Turnbull. It was really interesting. There are some questions already waiting for us. I'm going to read them in the most intuitive order. So the first one is, thank you very much for the interesting talk. As light fans out from the source, how does the communication system deal with the overlap between light sources?
Okay, that's a great question. So there are various techniques in data communication science that can deal with this problem. In the first instance, what you would try and do is you're trying to have your lighting units illuminating different regions, and that's essentially what happens in a cell phone network. That the transmitters are transmitting to individual cells with it over an area, and there's some overlap at the edges, but there's regions where there's only a single transmitter sending light. If you have an overlap of signals, then you can decouple that mathematically by knowing what data is being transmitted from these neighboring transmitters. And actually, there are ways to greatly increase the data rate by having arrays of multiple transmitters and multiple detectors that are potentially, where the multiple detectors are potentially receiving light from all of the multiple transmitters. And if you train the network of transmitters and receivers so that they know how much light each detector receives from each transmitter, then you can do some simple maths on the fly that can decouple those signals and potentially increase your data rate.
The chat is on, the Q&A is on fire.
Oh no.
So, is the development of organic semiconductors dependent on fossil fuels, or can they be made from non-petroleum products?
Oh, that's a question for the chemists. So I shall plead some ignorance on that in the as a physicist. They can be made from whatever, if we can make the feedstocks, the starting materials from non-petroleum sources, then the chemists are very good at then completing that synthesis. One thing about these materials is that we actually use incredibly small volumes of them. The combined thickness of the light emitting materials in an OLED display is about 100 nanometers thick, which is you could have 1,000 of those stacked on top of each other to get to the thickness of a hair. So the actual quantities of materials, if the fabrication process is efficient, is very, very small, and so you can get quite good value for whatever feedstocks you're putting in order to synthesize them.
Thank you. The next one is, thank you for an excellent presentation. Could these have medical applications, for example, detecting contaminants or pollutants in blood?
Yes, so my colleague Ivor Samuel has a number of projects looking at medical applications of organic semiconductors, partly using OLEDs and organic detectors in order to make essentially the technologies that could become a lab on a credit card to do point of care diagnostics. He's also developed light sources for treating skin cancer. and so there are various medical applications. From a sensing point of view, absolutely, there's also opportunities for looking at, for example, volatile organic compounds that come out of your breath, and these can be potentially used for diagnosing disease.
Okay, here's a little longer one. So do you see the LiFi system actually being part of the luminaire providing light to a room, or would it be more of a standalone system? The reason for asking is that when selecting lighting LEDs for commercial use, the selection of LEDs for each fitting is called binning. I think that's binning, right? The narrower the binning, the closer all of the LEDs are to being the same color. Or is LED output color irrelevant to data transmission?
Okay, so I think there's different ways that this technology could be implemented. Certainly the vision that has launched the field is that you would use the lighting units that you're illuminating the room with to transmit the data. And the reason for doing that is you're already using energy to provide lighting to your room, and so you can piggyback on that for free without having to use additional power to transmit the data. So that's certainly the main vision. Using visible light is attractive because then you can see as a user, you can see where that light is going to, and if you do need to align your detector to the light source, say for example you wanted to communicate with the cash machine and communicate with your bank, but from your mobile phone to the cash machine, then you can see where the information is going, and you can line that up if it's visible light. Is color relevant or not? There are opportunities to use different colored lights in order to give you what's called wavelength division multiplexing, and so you can send different information through different wavelength channels. That is not essential. There are many other ways in which you can try to combine together different transmitters without using the color change. And so I would think that probably it would work on a single dear.
So Professor Turnbull seems to be having a little technical glitch with his connection at the moment. We do still have a couple of questions, so hopefully we might be able to get him back. Do you think that might be possible? Should we give it a little bit of time? I think we might have lost him. Yes, I think we might have lost him. Okay, so thank you. Unfortunately, we have two more questions left. Actually, they were perfect to follow everything we've just had so far, and I'm sorry we haven't had a chance to ask them. So I will put them to Professor Turnbull anyway and see if there's a way that we can perhaps publish those questions later along with the video on YouTube. Thank you so much for coming this evening, and as you'll see in the chat, we are taking a break from the Saints Talks for a little bit, but we'll be back a little bit later on in the year. So thank you very much all for coming, and good night.